Hi friends, today we will look at an option for structuring an elementary music lesson plan. We will look at the structure that I recommend and why, along with some example lesson plans, but then we'll also back up and look at some lesson planning principles because we don't all need to use this exact same lesson template. So let's look at this layout. This lesson plan structure was put together by Jean Sinor, and we can see that it's divided into different sections. The main sections are the high concentration and the secondary concentration, and in between those you'll see that we have a change of pace. And then we're also bookending this lesson with some type of opening activity and some type of closing activity. First, let's look at an opening routine. This is the part of the lesson that really sets the stage for the rest of the class. And this part of the lesson plan is quite short. We really just need to get students in the room. We need to have a musical and a social experience, and then we need to get on to the next section. I won't go into this section too much because I have a video about opening routines, so I will link that up here if you want to hear more. Next is the high concentration portion. This is the main section of the lesson, and it's probably the section that's going to take up the most amount of our time. And that's because this is where we are working on our main objective for the day. So we might be playing songs on instruments by ear. We might be creating movement sequences. We could be orally identifying a new sound in a known song. We could be catching the teacher's notation mistake. Lots of things here. It just depends on where we are in the overall sequence of learning and our overall concept plan at this particular musical moment. The reason we put the main teaching objective here is that students have just come into the classroom. We've transitioned into music time from regular school time. And in terms of the energy of the class, this is where students are set up the best to be the most engaged and on task. So in this second grade example, we walk in, we have our opening routine to a known song. We're doing some type of active dance. This is one with body percussion and jumping, and it's very fun. And we do our musical warm-up, and then our main section, the high concentration, is Frog in the Meadow, where we are playing high, middle, and low in the song by ear on barred instruments. That's the main objective for the day, and that happens here at the beginning of class. Next is the change of pace. We can also help students stay on task by working with their natural attention spans. And that means that after we ask them to concentrate and work really hard on our musical objective, we're going to switch gears and do something different. And this is our change of pace section. Most likely, this is going to involve some type of singing game, but the important thing is that it's a break away from the previous section of the lesson, and it involves some type of physical movement. This is also a pretty short section of the lesson plan comparatively, and we are probably not going to spend a lot of time on whatever it is we are doing in this section. So however long our primary objective, our primary concentration section is, this might be half-ish of that. It's just enough time to play a few rounds of the game, maybe introduce something new, and then we move on. So here's a fourth grade example where we've done some reading in the primary focus of the lesson plan. And then here for the change of pace, we're going to sing and play the game to a known song. In this case, Víbora de la Mar. And in second grade, students don't know the game to come through the sawmill yet, but we are still breaking up the lesson plan by including some creative movement. It's a creative movement invitation with their partner. So there's still some free choice. There is still creativity happening in this change of pace section while we learn the game. And then we move into the next big section of the lesson plan, and that is the secondary concentration. This is where we are doing our second teaching objective for the day, and you will find a range of different opinions from teachers who use this template very successfully, and they'll say different things about these teaching objectives. Or a better way to say it is they'll focus on different things about these teaching objectives. So some people will say that ideally this lesson objective is one that is not as mentally taxing as what we asked students to do in the main concentration of the lesson plan earlier. And that makes sense because of what we talked about how student focus is generally the highest at the beginning of class. But you'll also find teachers who suggest that if the primary concentration is a melodic element, then the secondary concentration should ideally focus on a rhythmic element, and vice versa. If this top one is rhythmic, then the secondary should be melodic. And then there are other people who will say that the primary concentration is for preparation and the secondary concentration is for practice. And then there are people who break it down even more and have specific points in the prepare, present, practice sequence for each of these sections. So in that kind of train of thought, the primary concentration is for late preparation and early practice. Secondary concentration is for early preparation and late practice. So do with that what you will. This is not something that I get too particular about, but I do think it's worth noting because, again, we are all going to use this lesson plan template. For those of us who use it, we can all use it in a different way. And regardless, the idea here is that we are asking students, again, to give us their focus in this secondary concentration section. So in this second grade example, we are reading rhythms for the secondary concentration. And then in this fourth grade example, we are doing some conscious improvisation. And now we're on to the closing section of the lesson plan. Here, we're going to do something to wrap up our learning for the day and then maybe set something up for a future class. So in this fourth grade lesson, we are setting something up by introducing a mystery song that we will continue and learn the game to next class. In this second grade example, we have this really fun dance activity that we're doing with a pop song. And then the last thing to do is just getting students from wherever they are in the classroom to a line at the door. That's also going to be part of this at some point. And then this is a good time to review the day's objectives and have students self-assess their own progress if that's something that you do in your classroom. A really common question is how long to spend on each of these lesson segments, because music teachers don't have a standard amount of class time across America. There's a huge amount of variance from program to program. So I think of this more in terms of a shape or a percentage as opposed to an actual literal time amount. So in general, I am normally trying to make this kind of an accordion. So in a 30-minute lesson, the breakdown might look like an opening routine that is 3 to 5-ish minutes. High concentration might be 7 to 10. Our change of pace could be somewhere around 3 to 5-ish. And then secondary concentration, again, 7 to 10. And then a closing is 3 to 5. Again, big-ish on all of those. And then in a 45-minute lesson, the breakdown might be something a little bit closer to an opening routine that's 3 to 5-ish minutes, high concentration that's 10 to 15 or so, and then a change of pace, maybe 3 to 7, and then a secondary concentration 10 to 15-ish, and a closing that's 3 to 5-ish. Again, a big emphasis on the ish with all of these, because all of these times are different, but the overall shape of the lesson itself is still the same. So that accordion kind of shape is still happening. The other way that we know how long each lesson segment should last is just to pay attention to students, because when they are squirmy, when their attention drifts, that's them telling us that it's time to change something. In longer lessons, that might mean that we play the game to whatever song we're working on, and we play that game maybe like in the middle of a high concentration section. Or we just look for other ways to intentionally add some more physical activity to those sections of the lesson. So here's a fourth grade example with 4 white horses. We have some high concentration tasks that we're asking of students. And then I have that we're going to sing the song and play the game here in the middle of the primary focus. And then we are back to a reading activity. So something in there just to kind of break things up a little bit. So this lesson structure works really well, in my opinion, for the second half of the year in first grade or so through something like somewhere around 5th grade or so. So the bulk of our elementary classes, I really think this template works very, very well. For those bookend grades, for me, kindergarten and 5th grade, I do follow the same principles from this template, but I also make some tweaks to this because different ages just need different things developmentally. For kindergarten and first grade, the big difference is basically that I just add more songs. Our lesson segments are going to be about 5 minutes tops, 5 minutes at most. So I still include lesson objectives, but since each lesson segment itself is smaller, we can naturally just fit more songs into the lesson. So the result is that the lesson kind of just feels like a collection of songs rather than having like a big chunk of the lesson where we're focused on one or two things. So here's an example. In this example, we are working on 4 voices and our singing voice here at the beginning of the year. And a lot of these songs do focus on those curricular objectives, but each of the lesson segments, you can see that we'll be doing something like singing the song and playing a game, or singing a song and then there's like one 4 voices invitation, and then we're moving on to something else. So the pacing of these lower elementary lessons is really, really quick. We also have songs in here that are just for fun, just for the joy of making music together in our ensemble. With upper elementary, and specifically 5th grade later in the year, we are normally working on things that take a little bit more time, like working on some instrument activities. And so I'm less likely to do a structured change of pace section in the middle of the lesson. We still sing songs and we still play games for sure, but I'm more likely to add those into the primary and secondary concentration sections of the lesson plan. So here's an example from the planning binder, and in that curriculum, just to explain what we're looking at here, in that curriculum there are 3 different tracks that teachers can choose from: general music, recorder, and ukulele. So this lesson plan shows how teachers can choose the pathway they want to follow. After we all do this one activity together, then it kind of diverges after that. But you can see here that we are still going to sing songs and play games, but it's as a part of this primary concentration section. So like I said, this is the lesson template that I recommend, and that is for several reasons. The main one is just the pacing structure within the lesson I find to be really, really successful. And that's because there's a good amount of research that at the elementary level in particular, as an instructional activity goes on, student attention and their on-task behavior, those go down. So if we want students to stay on task and engaged, we would do well to keep our teaching windows pretty concise. And this lesson plan template, it breaks up the teaching windows in a way that I find to be really successful. We're not going to drag out an activity for too long because embedded in the lesson plan are these different sections where we're changing things up. And that really, really, really helps with focus and engagement. The other reason is that physical movement is an inherent part of this lesson plan template. And we also have a lot of research about incorporating physical activity into the lesson and how big of a difference that makes with how well students are able to maintain their focus and their on-task behavior. So students are more engaged when they are physically active. And that engagement from the physical activity, it continues even after that physical activity is over. So if we take a break and we do some type of movement, students are the most engaged in that movement activity, but then that focus will last through a good portion of the next section of the lesson. And then there are also particular benefits for incorporating physical movement into a subject-specific activity. So that is adding it into the academic content that we're already doing, as opposed to something totally separate like a brain break that has nothing to do with the actual content of the lesson. And that is exactly what a singing game is, right? It's a physical activity, it's physical movement, but it's in our subject-specific context. And then from a musical content perspective, I really like that musical concepts here are taught in a way that strategically builds a connection between these concepts from lesson to lesson. And this is different from teaching things in isolated units, right? So rather than having one unit on rhythm and then a unit on melody and then a unit where we learn how to play barred instruments, everything is integrated in a really authentic, musically authentic way. And it's the same thing as an academic classroom, because sometimes that comes up, that we have two different teaching objectives, but one might be rhythmic and one might be melodic, right? And that can strike administrators or even some of us, depending on your teaching background, that can strike us as kind of odd. But it's the same thing that we see in an academic classroom, where a second grade teacher might spend some of the day in a reading workshop, and then maybe some of the day on spelling, and then some of the day on writing. All three of those, the reading and the spelling and the writing, all three of those are one subject, ELA, right? But the teacher doesn't have one single ELA objective for the entire day. And they certainly don't teach one ELA focus for a unit in isolation. So if you imagine a second grade teacher taught an isolated unit on writing, and that was their objective. They're going to learn how to write. But while they're learning how to write, there is no reading instruction, there is no spelling instruction, it's just writing. And then after that writing unit, they switch to a spelling unit, but during the spelling unit, they don't do any writing and they don't do any reading. Right? That wouldn't make sense. It's not really how those processes, those ELA processes, are integrated together. So all of these focus areas, reading, spelling, writing, they are their own focus within a larger subject, but they aren't taught in isolation. They are taught in an integrated way. And that's how this lesson plan is set up as well. Music is a big subject, and everything that we do is interconnected. Okay, we already talked about how teachers who use this basic template can use it differently from each other. And I think it's really important to say that there are amazing and successful elementary music teachers, model elementary music teachers, who do not use this layout at all. They have a different template that they might be working with, maybe where they are doing one song for the entire lesson, or maybe one musical concept for the entire lesson. And in those cases, the shape basically looks something like this, with an opening and a main body section, and then a closing section. But it's important to note that for those teachers, they still would not do one single activity for the whole entire lesson. Things are still broken up. So this main body section would still have a variety of musical tasks. And a good example of this, in my mind, is Exploring Orff. It's from the book Exploring Orff. And in that template, there is a presentation, there's an exploration section, there is a conclusion, and then an evaluation. And the main body of the lesson plan is described here as a series of events. Right? So there are still many things happening in this main body of the lesson plan. So we are all different teachers, and we all teach in different situations, and we all have different approaches. But the big idea for teachers who structure lessons well is that they move between times where students are giving us concentrated focus and times that we are going to change things up. So having a musically and developmentally appropriate flow of activities is really important. One of the useful things and one of the tricky things about lesson planning this way, like we talked about, is that lesson plans are never isolated. They always build on what came before them, and they get students ready for what is going to happen next. And that's why concept plans are so useful. The video coming up next is about putting together a concept plan so that we can break it apart and sequence it in our lessons.